Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Laura and I like to craft stuff. Today is a compilation of the hand quilting I've been working on for this quilt. I started the hand quilting process back in September and I did not film the aligning of the top batting and the backing because I didn't want to film it again. The process is annoying and it involves me crawling around on the ground and um, so yeah. Just as a heads up with this particular hooping and circling that I'm working on right now, it looks like it's not flat, but that was because the that particular joint was a little bit warped, and so it will be flat when it's like laid out, but for the hooping it was not flat, and it needed to not be flat because of the warping. I was taught how to do this hooping method from my mom's boyfriend's eldest sister, the one and only time I got to meet her before she passed away. And she would normally start in the center of the quilt and then go in a spiral and work her way out. When I aligned the three parts together, I made sure to align one side and one and the top, and then left everything else the way that it was. Because in the past, when I've started from the center, I find that there's a lot more warping that happens than if you start from one corner. So, the best way to describe how I'm going about this is a backwards typewriter. Once I have one corner aligned and I know that the top is aligned, like the top side, one side is aligned and the other side is aligned from that corner, I go across the top with my hoop. And then once I'm finished with a row, I diagonally go back to the aligned side and do another row. And that can take some time, but I don't mind. I For this particular project, I had watched a few quilting like long arm videos, and I had learned that there are a lot of people who like heavily quilted quilts. And so I wanted to practice doing smaller stitches as well as doing it heavily quilted. The quilts that I've hand quilted in the past before this, the stitching size was more along the lines of basting stitches, and I had a lot of space that was not quilted, which is fine. One of the quilts that I have on my bed is a basting stitch size, not heavily quilted quilt, and it's holding up pretty well, and it's super fluffy and comfortable. So I think, really just depends on your preference. But it was something I wanted to practice and try. So I did. Like I said, I started this in September and I only just recently finished it, maybe like a week or two ago. So that's how many months? A lot of months. I wouldn't say normally my quilts for hand quilting take that long, but yeah, again, it was heavily quilted. I didn't draw out any kind of design. I just started with doing these little zigzag, squirrely Q patterns and eventually found a zigzaggy, loopy pattern that fit well within the triangles. And then, of course, did around the stitch in the ditch, which is stitching right next to your seams. There were a few, and you'll see a clip of it, so maybe I should hold off on talking about it. But there are some centers of my almost circular, angular blocks that were a solid color. And so for those, for most of those, I tried to do this little flower pattern instead of doing the zigzag pattern. But by the end of the quilt, I kept forgetting. So there are some that just have the zigzaggy, squirrely Q things. I do thoroughly enjoy hand sewing. I find it incredibly relaxing and mindless, so it's nice to do this while listening to TV shows or audiobooks or whatnot. I have done quite a few hand sewing projects that were not hand quilting. And for that, normally I would do a running stitch where I move the needle through the top and the bottom of the fabric to have it back through so that I'm not having to go back and forth with each hand. However, for the quilting process, there are too many layers for that to work well with keeping your stitches small. And one of the things that I wanted to focus on was keeping my stitches small. Are they super, super tiny? No. I would say I think I average about 4 stitches an inch. And I think the Victorian standard is like 6 or 8 or something like that. Something ridiculous. Nobody has Victorian time, okay? We don't live in that world anymore. So, yeah, I that's why I'm not doing it from just the top where you're putting it in through to the bottom and then lifting the needle to come back out with just the top hand, because it just doesn't work very well. I mean, if you use basting size stitches, that should be fine. But there's just too many layers, and I didn't do any kind of spray basting or anything. I did look at spray basting, and the ones that I saw were like $20, and I am not spending $20 on spray basting. I also was not worrying about burying my knots, partially because I did have a number of knots that wound up, like the thread itself knotted, and I couldn't unpick the knot, which was frustrating. And that might be resolved if I were to wax my thread, but I'm too lazy to do that. So I learned to use smaller lengths of thread, and that has helped. And I have gotten pretty good at unpicking knots now. I usually use a pin. But I watched a few videos on burying knots, and basically their advice is to make a small knot and pull it through part of the way so it's under one of the layers, but it's not all the way through. And I personally feel like that just creates a big, like, noticeable gap and hole. And it's also really difficult. Like, it puts a lot of strain on the quilt to try to pull through a knot. So I'm honestly given up on trying to bury knots. If there's a better way to do it, you got to let me know. Here I am uh readjusting and moving the hoop. So I finished a hoop and now I'm moving it. Now normally I can apply the top hoop, even out the top part, and you'll see I flip it over to straighten out the back of it. For this, it unpopped because it wasn't pulled properly. It wasn't like straightened out too much. Like there was a lot that I had to adjust, and so the bottom hoop popped out and I had to put it back on. You'll see. But basically with this, because I don't start from the center, I'm going in one direction for the most part, like a backward typewriter. You need to pay attention if you do this when you're pulling the back fabric, and not like severely pulling it to stretch it or anything, just like straightening it out. You need to pay attention to the direction that you're pulling in. So I always made sure that I was pulling diagonally away from where I was headed, if that makes any sense. So you don't want to go, or not away from, but towards where I'm planning on hooping, so away from things that have already been quilted. And I think that doing a spray basting, I worry that because this process takes so long and usually involves a lot of the quilt to be bunched up while I'm working on it, that the spray basting would come undone and then make it difficult for me to straighten out the back of the fabric when I'm in the hooping process. But the straightening of the back fabric and not having it basted, I haven't, the past few quilts of starting in the corner and doing this method, I haven't had any problems with misalignment or bunching, which I have had in the past when I've done center, starting from the center. So here I am. At this point, I am attaching the binding. I have completely finished all the way to the edge. I think I did a pretty good job of hand stitching a straight line along the edge, but I am going through and I am doing, what I'm sewing here is I'm actually attaching the bias, or not the bias, my edging tape, which I did not do on the bias, and it might have been more worthwhile to do it that way, but I didn't have enough fabric. So I cut strips of 2.5 inches and then ironed them in half. And so now I'm sewing them to the back, and I'm going to flip it over to sew it down to the front to create that binding. I think this is a pretty standard binding process. And I did pin for this one. Like a good girl, I pinned, but I still did struggle. And I think it's because of the weight of my quilt and the layout that I have. I made sure to be farther along on the table to try to like have the table help me hold the quilt in place as I was sewing. And I don't know if I need like a different needle or a different foot or something along those lines, but I did have difficulty, especially once sewing onto the front after I flipped it over. And again, I don't know if that was because it's not on the bias. It could be. I know you're supposed to. Did I? No. Because I don't like to do what I'm told. But it's still, I guess I say this every time, this is the best binding I have done so far. And that's all that I can hope for, really. Like I said, did pin it down. I wonder if maybe I should have pinned more, which if so, I need to get more pins because I think I ran out of pins. I was very close to running out of pins. I stabbed myself with the pins a lot during this process, especially sewing the top part of the binding down, which was not fun. There was a lot of swearing involved. a lot of swearing involved. Yeah, see, I think looking at the video now, there was a lot of me adjusting, and I wonder, should I have hand basted it down and then sewn on top of it? Should I have done more pins? Because there was a lot of adjusting to make sure it was in the right spot. So it makes me think that I didn't have enough pins, and that's why I was struggling so much. From far away, it looks even. But when you look at it up close, you can tell that my sewing line is not straight because I'm struggling with, it was a struggle. It was a struggle, let's just say that. I think, yeah, I'm currently quilting another one. I'm in the quilting process of another quilt. So I think I will pin more and see how that goes. Or maybe basting spray would work for this. Let me know. It might not be strong enough though, because I'm having it flip over. I don't know. I have to say, the binding is not my favorite part. I thoroughly enjoy the hand quilting process. I hate binding. I'm really not a fan. It's almost to a point where I wonder maybe I should just do the whole binding by hand because I might have an easier, better time with that. I'm pretty confident in my hand stitching abilities and my, like I said, my lines, my straight lines that I had to do for the edge were really good. There was only one edge that was not straight. And here is a close-up view of all of my hand quilting. I think this looks beautiful. It's certainly not fluffy, but it's warm. In fact, I've had it on my bed and I've had to kick it off a few times because I have like 3 blankets that I'm using currently. And this one adds a lot more warmth than you would think because it is pretty thin. But it is warm. It is warm. It's dense. How about that? I do have a lot of threads on the back. I don't know if you'll see it in the video clip. My intention was to tie them up and trim them. Any of the like knots that were super long in thread. Some of them I just left. But it's also my quilt and it's on my bed. And I don't care. I might do it someday, but not today. Well, you can see some of them. Yeah, I have not, even with some of the other ones where I did not make my knots so tiny, I never really feel the knots on the back of the quilt. So I don't think it's a problem to not bury your knots. And here it is, the entire thing finished. I really do love this quilt so much. I'm quite proud of my stitching. And even though it took longer, much longer, the quilting process than any other quilt I've done, I don't mind at all. It was worthwhile. Although I think going forward, I may just stick to stitching in the ditch because that's going to be a lot faster and fluffier. I like fluffy quilts too. Thank you so much for joining me in this quilting video. If you like watching people working on stuff, you want to get inspired or anything along those lines, see what I'm doing next, like, subscribe, and yeah, I will let you guys go, and I'll see you in the next one. Okay. Thank you. Bye.